Smoke drifted across a sky that no longer trembled with bombers. The war in Europe had ended, yet the air in Germany felt heavy, unsettled, as if the ground itself didn't quite believe the guns had gone silent. In the ruins of a once proud Reich, women stood in doorways with hollow eyes, watching American jeeps roll past cracked facades. Among them was Lieselotte Weber, 26, a former Luftwaffe communications aide who had spent the last 2 years inside echoing concrete bunkers, routing messages she was never allowed to read. She clutched a thin satchel containing a change of clothes and a small photograph of her younger brother, still missing on the Eastern Front. Around her, other women shifted nervously, their gray auxiliary uniforms already stripped of insignia, but still marking them as the defeated. They had imagined many endings to the war. Capture by the Soviets, which meant stories whispered in terror. Trains to Siberia. Hunger that hollowed bodies into shadows. Or perhaps a quiet return home if they could blend into the tide of refugees. Few imagined this. Being rounded up by American military police, their papers examined by men who spoke in brisk, unfamiliar English, then told they would be shipped across the ocean itself. The ocean! It sounded like exile to the moon. Lieselotte tried to keep her face calm when she heard the orders. Some women sobbed openly. Others cursed under their breath, clutching their coats as if cloth could anchor them. On the dock at Bremerhaven, May sunlight sparkled cruelly on the water. The Liberty ship loomed massive and gray, ropes groaning as sailors secured it. The Americans herded them aboard with efficiency rather than malice. No shouting, no beating, but no softness either. A Red Cross nurse, American, cheerful in a way that felt foreign, handed out small paper cups of weak coffee. Lieselotte hadn't tasted coffee in months. It was bitter and thin, but shockingly warm in her hands. She felt her first small crack of confusion. The enemy served coffee? As the ship cut westward into the Atlantic, the women lingered on deck when allowed. Sea spray slicked their hair, and gulls followed until the shore was only a gray smear. Conversations ebbed and flowed in low, anxious German. Gerda Klein, once a typist for an anti-aircraft command, tried to joke that perhaps they were being taken to Hollywood to be extras in American war movies. Laughter came thin and brittle. Most were too sick with fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what America might do to them. Fear of never seeing home again. Nights were worst. The steel hull creaked. Waves thudded like distant artillery. And the women whispered prayers to Catholic saints or muttered the Lutheran Lord's Prayer. Lieselotte pressed her brother's photo to her chest and tried to picture him alive somewhere, maybe unaware that his sister was crossing the ocean as a prisoner. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning haze, it felt surreal. They had seen her only in propaganda posters, often mocked as decadent. Yet there she was, torch aloft against a skyline of jagged towers. The ship's deck grew silent. A few women cried quietly. Gerda whispered, "So it's real." Lieselotte felt something shift inside her, a thin crack in the black and white world she'd been taught to believe in. But she buried the thought quickly. She was still a captive. Their first stop was a military processing center in New Jersey. The Americans photographed them, fingerprinted them, and checked them for contraband. The procedures were brisk, but not cruel. Some guards even smiled. Not the smiles of victors mocking the defeated, but casual, almost bored grins. It was disorienting. One young corporal muttered a greeting in broken German to Lieselotte as he stamped her file. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, a strange mix of embarrassment and relief. From there, trains carried them inland. The journey through the American heartland unfolded like a dream. Miles of green fields swept past. Farmhouses gleamed white. Children waved at the passing POW cars. Some townspeople stared but did not jeer. One evening, the train paused near a station where a Coca-Cola sign glowed red against the dusk. A symbol they'd seen in captured rations, but never in neon light. The world outside their windows seemed untouched by war, impossibly prosperous. For women who had lived through nights of sirens and cellar walls trembling under bombs, this quiet abundance felt almost unreal. At last, after days of travel, the prisoners arrived at a camp in Texas. Heat shimmered over barbed wire fences. Guard towers watched but did not menace. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stood neat and orderly. There were showers, real showers with running water. The mess hall smelled of bread and some kind of meat stew. An American officer, middle-aged, with sunburned cheeks and a voice like gravel, addressed them through a translator. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work if assigned, you will be paid a small wage, and you will be safe here." Safe. The word hung in the dusty air. Safe from bombs. Safe from revenge. Safe, at least for now, from hunger. That night, Liselott lay on a narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling fan creaking lazily overhead. She thought of the ruins of Cologne where she had last seen home, of her mother's face lined with worry, of radio static filling the air raid shelters. Here there was silence except for cicadas and distant train whistles. She did not feel free, but she did not feel terrified either. It was a strange, disorienting in-between. In the days that followed, small astonishments kept puncturing her defenses. The food was plain but ample. They were given books, American novels, dictionaries, even German classics. They could send letters home through the Red Cross. Some women were assigned to agricultural work, picking fruit under the wide Texan sky. It was labor, yes, but not the back-breaking punishment they had feared. And then came the first shock of technology. One humid afternoon, an American sergeant came to their barracks with a clipboard. "We have authorization for certain prisoners to make supervised telephone calls to the International Red Cross or to registered family addresses in occupied Germany," the translator explained. Murmurs swept the room. Telephone calls? Across the ocean? Gerda laughed out loud, thinking it was a joke. But the sergeant only shrugged and pointed toward a small administration building where a black rotary phone sat, waiting. For Liselott, who in all her 26 years had rarely touched a telephone except in military offices, the idea was unthinkable. In wartime Germany, long-distance lines were rationed and unreliable. Most families had never owned a phone at all. Yet here the Americans treated it as routine. A woman ahead of her dialed nervously, listened, and suddenly sobbed, hearing a distant mother's voice crackling through the line. The room fell utterly silent, except for that fragile, impossible connection. A voice carried across continents and oceans by wires and switches. Liselotta's turn came. Her hands trembled as the sergeant guided her through the process. She reached the Red Cross, left a message for any surviving family to know she was alive. When she hung up, her knees felt weak. Something had shifted, quietly but irreversibly. The war had been fought in mud and blood. Yet here was a world where voices could leap across oceans with the twist of a dial. A world that felt modern, open, alive in ways she had never imagined. That night, she couldn't sleep. Around her, other women whispered about the call, about the Americans, about the strange kindness and strange power of a land that could feed its captives and let them speak across the sea. They were still prisoners, yes, still defeated, but something unexpected had entered their lives. A glimpse of a different world, one humming with invisible wires and quiet generosity. And as Liselotta closed her eyes, one thought flickered, dangerous and new. Perhaps everything we were taught was wrong. Morning in Texas arrived with a fierce, white sun that baked the earth until it cracked. The camp stirred awake to the whine of cicadas and the clang of the mess hall bell. Liselott stepped from the barracks and blinked into the brightness, the air thick with heat already, though it was barely 7. Around her, women shuffled toward breakfast, hair tied back, uniforms traded for plain work clothes issued by the Americans. A faint smell of bread drifted on the breeze. Not the dense rye of home, but something lighter, softer. She followed the line, stomach knotted with hunger and curiosity. Inside the hall, long tables filled with steaming trays. Eggs, oatmeal, even coffee. It was no banquet, but to women who had survived winters on black bread and watery soup, it felt like wealth. Gerda sat across from Lieselotte, grinning as she poured sugar into her cup. "They feed us better than we fed ourselves," she whispered. Her tone was joking, but her eyes were watchful, as though still searching for the trick. Lieselotte smiled faintly and said nothing, tasting the bitter coffee with a disbelief that had not yet worn off. Life settled into a strange rhythm. Work assignments were posted each morning. Some women weeded vegetable gardens inside the fence. Others, like Lieselotte and Gerda, were sent under guard to nearby farms. There they picked cotton or fruit under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow them whole. The land was dusty, endless, humming with grasshoppers and distant trains. American farmers watched them with wary curiosity, but little hatred. Sometimes they offered cold water or even a slice of melon. And though conversation was mostly gestures and awkward English, it was enough to unsettle old fears. Gerda confessed one evening as they trudged back dusty and sunburned, "I thought we'd be beasts to them. But they just work beside us." The guards, too, were not what propaganda had promised. Some were stern, but others were almost fatherly. Sergeant Miller, who oversaw the work details, spoke halting German learned from his immigrant grandparents. He asked about their families, sometimes offered cigarettes, and once even laughed when Gerda tried to explain the convoluted German word for cotton boll. "You girls are tough," he said one afternoon. And though the words were casual, Lieselotte felt the oddest jolt of dignity. Here, the enemy could still see her as a person. Evenings in the camp were quiet, almost domestic. The barracks smelled of soap and warm wood. Women mended clothes, swapped stories, and tried to teach each other bits of English. The Americans had provided a small library. There were German classics, but also Mark Twain and Jack London. Lieselotte discovered she liked reading aloud, her voice carrying in the humid dusk as fireflies winked beyond the wire. For a few minutes, the war seemed impossibly far away. Yet the barbed wire was always there, glittering in the moonlight, a reminder that kindness was not freedom. The women learned to live with this duality, safety without control, comfort without home. Some grew restless, muttering about humiliation, about being reduced to farmhands. Others surrendered to the calm, grateful for full bellies and nights without air raid sirens. Lieselotte balanced uneasily between the two. She could feel the old certainties of her training cracking, but the space beyond them felt frighteningly empty. Technology was the sharpest crack. The first telephone call had stunned her, but more surprises followed. Radios played everywhere. Country music twanged from the guard towers, and news bulletins crackled through the administrative office. One evening, an American invited a few of the German women to hear a live broadcast of a baseball game. The jargon was incomprehensible, but the idea that voices, music, whole events could travel invisible through the air felt like magic. Germany had radio, of course, but it had been a weapon there. Controlled, grim, endless speeches. Here it was easy, joyful, full of laughter. Lieselotte found herself listening, trying to catch words. Letters, too, became lifelines. The Red Cross delivered pale envelopes bearing news from home. A mother safe in Bonn, a cousin missing, a city in rubble. Lieselotte's first letter came after weeks of waiting. Her mother wrote in trembling script that the house still stood, but food was scarce. She thanked God Lieselotte was alive. Reading it, Lieselotte's throat tightened. For the first time since capture, she wept quietly into her pillow, the tears tasting of relief and guilt. Not all women handled this new world with grace. Helga, once a fierce believer in the Reich, railed against the enemy's tricks. She refused to speak English, refused to touch American books, and warned others that soft treatment was meant to break their pride. "Don't be fooled," she hissed one night. "We are prisoners. They show comfort only to humiliate." Some nodded, uneasy. Others rolled their eyes. Gerda scoffed later, whispering to Lieselotte, "If kindness is humiliation, I'll take it." Still, Helga's words lingered. Was this comfort a trap? Were they being remade quietly, without realizing it? Lieselotte pondered it as she worked in the fields, sweat soaking her back, watching a distant farmhouse where a telephone wire sagged between poles. Each day the Americans seemed less like caricatures and more like people. Ordinary, confident, free in ways she did not understand. That freedom frightened and fascinated her. The camp also brought glimpses of American womanhood that challenged everything Nazi propaganda had taught. Female guards worked alongside men. Nurses ran clinics with brisk authority. Local women drove trucks to deliver supplies, laughing easily with soldiers. Lieselotte and her companions had been told that American women were frivolous, weak, corrupted by luxury. Yet here they were, capable and respected. Gerda remarked after seeing a young nurse give orders to 2 soldiers, "Imagine trying that in Berlin." They laughed, but uneasily. A seed of doubt had taken root. One sticky July afternoon, the camp administration called for volunteers to help repair telephone lines damaged by a storm. Lieselotte, curious, stepped forward. She spent hours watching American technicians climb poles, strip wires, and reconnect circuits. The men joked as they worked, moving with casual mastery. At one point, an older lineman let her hold a coiled wire, explaining in broken German how voices traveled through copper and current. It was dizzying, this invisible network stretching across a continent. In Germany, such infrastructure had been fragile, bombed, censored. Here, it seemed limitless. That night she tried to describe the feeling to Gerda. "It's as if they all belong to one great web," she said slowly, struggling for words. "They can talk to anyone, anywhere. They are connected." Gerda nodded, thoughtful. "And we were kept apart." For Lieselotte, that realization was both wonder and wound. She thought of her brother, lost somewhere in the East, unreachable. She thought of the regime that had promised unity, yet left its people isolated, silenced, fed only slogans. Here in captivity, she felt a strange kind of access, a glimpse of a world knit together by wires and freedom. It unsettled her more than any guard's rifle. Yet beneath the quiet life of the camp ran an undercurrent she could not ignore. Rumors circulated. Lectures about democracy might soon be offered, newsreels about America shown to prisoners. Some welcomed the idea, hungry for distraction. Others bristled, afraid of brainwashing. Helga warned darkly, "They want to change us before they send us home." Lieselotte felt the warning land somewhere deep, but she could not decide if that was threat or opportunity. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, the guards set up a portable projector in the yard. Prisoners gathered on benches, curious. The film that flickered to life was not propaganda in the shrill Nazi style, but something quieter. Scenes of American cities, schools, factories. Children played in leafy suburbs. Women in neat dresses answered telephones with easy smiles. The narrator spoke in calm, translated German about prosperity and freedom. Lieselotte watched, transfixed. It was not mockery, not aggression, just a window into another life. When the film ended, silence hung heavy. Some scoffed, some murmured questions, some stared at the ground. Lieselotte felt a slow tremor inside, as though the world she had known was crumbling from an unexpected angle. Not from bombs, but from possibility. She glanced at Gerda, who met her eyes with the same unspoken thought. Perhaps this captivity was more than survival. Perhaps it was an invitation, terrifying and irresistible. And as the projector's bulb cooled with a faint hiss, Lieselotte sensed that the true battle had only just begun, not of guns and orders, but of ideas that could travel faster than any soldier, across oceans, along the very wires she had once routed for war. Autumn crept across Texas in muted golds and browns, the heat softening, the air turning crisp enough to sting when the sun fell. Life in the camp, once alien and frightening, had begun to feel strangely routine. Yet under that routine, something deliberate stirred, subtle but unmistakable. It began with notices pinned to the bulletin board, typed sheets in careful German inviting prisoners to evening cultural lectures. Some dismissed them as harmless distractions. Others, like Helga, saw poison. "This is where they slip inside your head," she muttered, tearing one down before a guard replaced it an hour later. Lieselotte studied the invitation with a quiet unease. "The United States, a democracy in action," it read. Curiosity tugged at her, despite the warning voice she'd begun to recognize. The part of her trained to resist anything foreign. But another part, growing louder since the day she first touched a telephone, whispered that understanding was not surrender. One evening she and Gerda went, slipping into the small recreation hall that smelled of pine boards and chalk dust. Inside, an American officer with kind eyes and slow German greeted them. He spoke not of conquest, but of voting, of free newspapers, of ordinary citizens shaping policy. A short film followed. Bustling cities, jazz spilling from radios, children of every background walking to bright schoolhouses. There were no jeers, no pounding fists, only a calm presentation of life beyond the wire. Lieselotte watched, wary but fascinated. It was not the decadent chaos she had been promised. It was order built from choice. Gerda leaned close and whispered, "It's so normal." Lieselotte felt a jolt of recognition. Normal, but powerful. Over the following weeks, these lectures multiplied. There were language classes, civics lessons, even small debates, where Germans were invited to ask questions, cautiously at first, then with growing boldness. Sergeant Miller, the same man who had once joked in broken German about cotton bolls, sat at the back and smiled as if this were all part of some plan. Perhaps it was. The Americans seemed to know that force could shatter bodies, but only ideas could rebuild minds. Helga fought back with stubborn silence. She warned that attending was betrayal, that listening meant forgetting. "They want to send us home tame," she snapped one night, face flushed in the lantern glow. "They want to turn us into puppets." No one answered her directly, but Lieselotte saw the doubt ripple through the room. It was easier to hold hatred when the enemy stayed faceless. Here, the enemy had names, smiles, patient explanations. Letters from home added another crack. The war's end had not brought peace. It had brought hunger, rubble, Soviet patrols in the east. Lieselotte's mother wrote of long queues for bread, of walls still blown open to the sky. America, meanwhile, hummed with cars and neon, its rail lines alive, its telephones unbroken. The contrast gnawed at Lieselotte. She loved her country, but what had it done for her except bury her brother and feed her slogans? Here, in captivity, she was learning truths forbidden back home. Truths about freedom that felt both intoxicating and frightening. One afternoon, she was assigned clerical work in the camp office, copying forms and organizing supply lists. There she overheard two American officers discussing a reorientation program. One spoke plainly, "If these prisoners return understanding democracy, we've won more than a war." The words struck her like a sudden gust of cold air. She was part of something larger than survival. A campaign fought not with rifles, but with ideas, woven into every kindness, every class, every unexpected privilege. The Americans weren't simply humane, they were strategic. That night she told Gerda what she'd heard. Gerda shrugged, thoughtful rather than alarmed. If they want to show us how not to repeat this nightmare, maybe that's not so bad. Lieselotte couldn't answer. She felt caught between shame at being an object of persuasion and a fragile hope that perhaps another way of living existed. The most potent weapon remained the everyday marvel of connection. Each time someone made a phone call home, voice carried effortlessly over invisible lines, it felt like a small rebellion against the isolation that had once defined German life. Radios in the guard posts broadcast jazz and news from faraway cities. Newspapers circulated, uncensored, messy but alive with argument. The message was wordless but clear. Information here flowed, not dictated, but shared. For women raised under a regime that measured loyalty by silence, it was intoxicating. Helga grew increasingly brittle, her defiance sharpening into fear. "They are undoing us," she hissed, when another woman returned glowing from a letter-writing session where an American volunteer had helped craft careful German script. "One day you'll thank them for the chains." Yet fewer listened now. Kindness, abundance, and the quiet dignity of being treated as human had a gravity of its own. The lectures did not preach, they invited, and invitation, Lieselotte realized, could be more dangerous than command. One evening, as cool air swept the camp and the smell of mesquite drifted over the fence, the women gathered for another film. This one was about the Marshall Plan, though they didn't yet know the term. Grainy footage showed Europe in ruins, then ships unloading food, trucks delivering aid, cities rising from rubble. The narrator's voice, deliberate and calm, spoke of rebuilding, partnership, and a future beyond hatred. Lieselotte's chest tightened, watching bricks lifted into place where bombs had fallen. It was a vision of healing she had never been offered. Afterward, in the soft murmur of returning to the barracks, Gerda asked quietly, "Do you think they want us to love them?" Lieselotte hesitated. Maybe not love, maybe to understand. She surprised herself with the answer. Understanding felt almost more dangerous than love. It could slip past defenses and stay. She lay awake long after lights out, staring at the dark rafters, listening to the faint hum of a generator somewhere beyond the wire. The war had taught her to fear power as tanks and bombs. Here she was, discovering a different kind. Power that fed rather than starved, that educated rather than silenced, that built roads of words and wires. It was not gentle in its effect. It was quietly, relentlessly persuasive. When Helga finally packed her few belongings to be transferred, she had volunteered for repatriation at the first chance, she spat one last warning. "You're forgetting who you are." But Lieselotte no longer knew what that meant. Who she was had changed each time she touched a telephone, each time she listened to a democracy lecture, each time she realized she was not invisible. She watched Helga go with a mix of pity and envy. Pity for her certainty, envy for its simplicity. Outside, the Texas night stretched wide, stars cold and brilliant. Somewhere a telephone rang in the administrative hut, its bell crisp and confident. Lieselotte closed her eyes, feeling the sound vibrate through the quiet camp. She understood now that the Americans were fighting a war she hadn't recognized, one for the minds of their captives. And she felt, with a shiver she couldn't name, that she might already be losing. The ship that carried Lieselotte back across the Atlantic in 1946 moved more slowly than the one that had taken her away. The sea was calmer, but her mind was not. She leaned against the rail as gray waves heaved and fell, clutching the single suitcase she had packed in Texas. A few dresses, an English dictionary, and the Red Cross letters she had saved like talismans. Around her, other women murmured about homecomings. Some dreamed aloud of mothers' kitchens, of familiar church bells. Others were silent, bracing for a country they suspected would not be the one they had left. Gerda stood nearby, face hidden under a scarf, her eyes unreadable as the wind whipped it loose. Germany appeared first as a haze, then as jagged ruins. The docks of Bremerhaven were quieter now, but the buildings behind them looked wounded, walls peeled open to the cold. When Liselott stepped ashore, a bitter smell of coal smoke and damp brick filled her lungs. She had imagined relief. Instead, she felt a hollow ache. Her first sight of home was rubble piled like broken teeth, children barefoot among debris, and faces that no longer expected miracles. Her mother met her with tears, and an embrace so fierce Liselott could hardly breathe. The house still stood, but was dark and cramped, windows stuffed with blankets against the wind. That night, they sat at a small table lit by a single candle. Her mother spoke softly of ration cards, of black markets, of neighbors lost or gone east. Liselotte listened, nodding, but inside she was somewhere else, in a Texan field under a limitless sky, in a library filled with unburned books, in a room where telephones rang as if the whole world were reachable. She did not know how to explain this to a woman who had survived on silence and scarcity. In the following weeks, she searched for her brother, but he was gone. Another name swallowed by the Eastern Front. Each visit to an office meant forms stamped by weary clerks. Each inquiry met with shrugs. The grief was sharp, but so was the recognition that here, information traveled slowly, grudgingly, if at all. She thought of the effortless call she had made months earlier in Texas, and felt almost dizzy with contrast. Gerda visited once, thinner but wry as ever. They shared weak coffee in the cold kitchen, speaking quietly while Liselotte's mother rested in another room. Gerda described her own return, the suspicion in neighbors' eyes, the muttered accusations that those who had lived in America had been softened. "They think we were pampered," she said, voice edged with bitterness. "They have no idea," Liselott nodded. They had seen a different world, and that knowledge now sat between them like an unspeakable secret. At first, Liselotte tried to keep her memories private, but rebuilding required choices. What to believe, what to hope for, how to move forward. She found herself speaking up when neighbors raged that only strength and obedience could save Germany again. She talked, cautiously, about fairness, about the power of communication, about what it meant when a government trusted its citizens enough to let voices travel unguarded. Some dismissed her as naive. Others listened with quiet hunger, as though starved for more than bread. It was not easy. Helga, who had returned before them, spread warnings that American captivity had turned women into traitors. Some men sneered when Liselott expressed new ideas about freedom. Yet she could not unsee what she had seen. A nation strong because it was open, not because it was feared. That belief burned hotter than shame or doubt. One afternoon, she walked through the ruined center of Cologne, where workers were clearing streets brick by brick. Among the tangle of wires overhead, a new telephone line had been strung, fragile but promising. She stopped beneath it, staring upward as the wind hummed through the cable. For a moment, she was back in Texas, the first time she heard a voice leap an ocean. She understood now how something so simple could be revolutionary. Connection meant more than convenience. It meant the end of isolation that had made tyranny possible. That night, in the flicker of an oil lamp, Liselott wrote a letter, not to America, but to a local committee trying to rebuild a democratic city council. She offered to help with clerical work, to translate, to teach what little English she knew. It was a small act, but her hand trembled as she signed her name. She was no longer only a former auxiliary or a prisoner. She was someone who had seen another path. Gerda wrote weeks later, saying she too had found work with a relief office, helping displaced families contact relatives abroad. "We know how to bridge worlds now," she wrote. Liselott smiled through sudden tears. They had been taken as enemies and returned as something stranger, witnesses to an idea. Winter came early, cold and hard, but in her chest burned a quiet certainty that frightened and thrilled her. Wars end when armies surrender. But peace is won when people refuse to be walled off from one another. She had learned that lesson not from lectures alone, but from the hum of a wire, the ring of a distant telephone, the unexpected kindness of an enemy determined to win hearts without firing a shot. As she sealed another letter, this one to a refugee cousin somewhere in the West, she paused, hearing in her memory the sharp, clean bell of that first call in Texas. It echoed like a summons across time, proof that ideas could cross oceans faster than armies. Outside, men strung new wires through the ruins, and she felt a strange, electric hope. The war she had lost had ended. The one worth fighting, for connection, for truth, for a freer Germany, was only beginning.